All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm guessing everybody's had a few minutes to sort of straighten their legs and have a cup of tea or something, and we'll get started with the second session so that we don't make the online session too long. Uh, we are continuing to change the frame slightly, moving to the Indian Ocean rim, particularly, and generally trying to talk about the global South and the context of solidarity at a transnational connection level. Um, I will not say too much about the event because the roundtable, because I guess Peter and Vladimir might have their own things to say. So I will leave it to them, and yeah, we'll keep this session another 1 hour, 15 minutes before we go on to the third panel. So with that, Peter and Vladimir, please take it. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and welcome panel to this second session in this PATIO Symposium. My name's Peter Scriver, and with my colleague Vladimir Kulić, who is sitting in Iowa, I am delighted to be co-chairing this session entitled Constructing South-South Cooperation. Following on from the preceding session with its focus on architectures of solidarity, our invited speakers will briefly share content and insights from their ongoing research into how multilateral cooperation in the construction of architecture and infrastructure between the 1950s and 1970s tangibly materialized concepts of third world solidarity and non-alignment, emerging from the politics of resistance to Cold War rivalry and the divided world making that dominated post-colonial development in those decades. Featuring a selection of case studies from the larger South-South project that Amat and I will discuss more broadly in the final talk of this morning. These cases offer concrete illustrations of collaboration across our particular theater of interest in PATIO, that is the intersecting Afro-Asian worlds interconnected by the Indian Ocean rim. From the repurposing of colonial architecture in post-independence Bandung as a theater for framing radical new ideas of Afro-Asian commonality, and the sharing of comparably radical new construction systems and capacities to support parallel aspirations toward African unity, to India-Africa technical cooperation in soil engineering, crucial to the construction of modern roads and infrastructure. We hope this session will reveal and provoke further critical inquiry into how the built projects to be discussed were simultaneously stages for solidarity, practices of cooperation, and the material results of novel transnational networks of exchange that largely subverted the dominant north-south axes of international technical aid. I'm going to hand over now to Vladimir to introduce our speakers, and then we'll proceed directly to the talks.
Good morning, good evening, good whatever time you may be at the moment from me as well. I will introduce our 5 speakers. We have 4 papers. One of them will be sort of vicariously presented in an abbreviated version by Amit, but I will introduce everyone. So Priya Jain is associate professor in the Department of Architecture at Texas A&M University. She's a licensed architect in both the US and India, and her teaching and research focus on 20th century South Asian architectural history and preservation. Priya is the secretary and board member of the nonprofit Historic Preservation Education Foundation and is incredibly active professionally in multiple groups in the Society of Architectural Historians and other organizations. She's the field editor for Getty Conservation Institute, serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Architectural Education, and so on. And her work has been published widely in scholarly journals and edited book volumes, and supported by a number of prominent institutions. Rina Priyani is a Mellon Race, Place, and Equity postdoctoral research associate and the incoming assistant professor in the Department of Architectural History at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on the racialization of urban space and landscape in colonial and post-colonial Southeast Asia. Rina's current book project, Building Bandung, Colonialism, Ethnic Identities, and Architectural Practices in Indonesia, examines the reinvention of the city of Bandung in West Java, starting with the historic Afro-Asian and Asian African or Asian African Conference, known as the Bandung Conference of 1955. Then we have Mark Olweny, who's a visiting associate professor at Florida A&M University and an adjunct associate professor at Uganda Martyrs University. Mark has also been widely active professionally, involved in architecture education in Australia, China, Uganda, the United States, and the UK, and he practiced architecture in Canada, Ireland, and Uganda. He focuses on documenting architectural knowledge, examining the social political contexts of design, and advancing critical discourse on 20th century architecture and urbanism of sub-Saharan Africa. He advocates for the preservation of architectural archives as an essential resource for understanding architectural heritage across sub-Saharan Africa. Anthony Wako is a lecturer and researcher at the Faculty of the Built Environment, Uganda Martyrs University, and is the current Emerging Architect Fellow at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. His teaching and research interests encompass history, theory, built heritage, and sustainable built environments. Anthony is a recipient of the 2024 Grant Foundation grant for his project, tracing the footprints of entangled narratives of South Asian migrants to Uganda between 1900 and 1972, which explores the South Asian community's contribution to the architecture and urbanism of Uganda's urban landscape. And last but not least, Shivani Shede is the visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute in New York City, and she previously taught at Princeton and Yale. She recently received her PhD from Princeton University, where she defended a dissertation on architecture and culture in Afro-Asian solidarity between 1947 and 1977. She has also published widely in New York Review of Architecture, Flux, and other venues. So without much further ado, we will start with the papers. We will hear all of our speakers first, and then we'll open the discussion to all of our participants.
So I think we'll proceed with Rina first.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good day. So let me share my screen here. Right. So thank you for the invitation, Amit, Peter, and Vladimir. So this is actually a chapter that I submitted for the South-South book, which is based on my ongoing research and also my dissertation on Bandung. The title of the chapter is Constructing the Bandung Spirit, Reproposing Colonial Bandung for the 1955 Asian African Conference in Indonesia. So as you see, the stamps here, I will be focusing on the venue, which is the building, as it's called Merdeka, or Freedom or Independence Building. So the Asian African or Afro-Asian Conference in 1955, known as the Bandung Conference, imagine a movement of the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, throwing off the yoke of European colonialism and joining in mutual solidarity to support the development and cultural as well as political independence. So the solidarity here is which is like based on the Bandung spirit later, is it to acknowledge the difference, the diversity, rather than the similarity among Afro-Asian nations, but also to hello to there's like a common vision to self-determination and also most likely political independence. And this solidarity is situated in the Cold War. So instead of aligning with the two powers of the Cold War, the new nations decided to determine their own movement and national trajectories. So my presentation here will focus on the architectural aspect, the architectural preparation of this conference, which is when the Joint Secretariat of the prospective conference chose Bandung. They chose the city and buildings that were an icon of the society of the Dutch colonial plantation. So there are two Bandungs that I'm actually put in a dialogue in my work, like Bandung as a movement, as a solidarity, as a kind of like venue. But the second is actually a city, which is a southeast of Jakarta. It's a mountain city. I'm actually speaking now from Charlottesville, Virginia, reminding me of how like Charlottesville to Washington, D.C. It's a kind of like Bandung to Jakarta for me. So the other aspect that I actually looking at in this research is how, so these are like 29 countries, but there are also conflicts and contradiction that actually happening. So for example, the two Vietnams were invited, why the two Koreas were not. The two Vietnam decided not to sit with each other. So there's also a manifestation of political alignment that actually happened in the conference. The other aspect that is actually I look at, of course, besides of the moment of the conference itself, this repurposing Bandung most likely actually how to adapt colonial spaces for new purposes. And in this case, I will look at the Concordia Theater is a part of the Plantation Society Center, which actually preserved and renamed by Sukarno, the first president, who was also an architect. And this building was actually designed by one of his mentor, a Dutch architect called Schumacher, and how this event of Bandung not only repurposing a colonial building, but also changing the narrative or the historical narrative of the city itself. So Dutch Bandung becoming Indonesian Bandung through this moment of solidarity. So these are like, I'm actually following the kind of like how these spaces actually change over time. This is actually when it was built as a box, and then there is like additional theater in the 1935, and this space actually becoming curved later, and then that curve symbolized as well the flags of the new nations of the Afro-Asian nation. So in this case, my research draws on the concept of diplomacy as theater, which is constructed by historian Naoko Shimazu. And this chapter examines how the theatrical performance of the Bandung Conference helped to legitimize the establishment of this movement while transforming the experience of urban space. So these are kind of like scholarship, kind of to see how actually this event allow at least two generations of architects that one is actually designing the building during the Dutch colonial regime, and then Sukarno, or this book is actually written in Indonesian, called Bung Karno, meaning brother Karno, the kind of like a continuation as a post-colonial nation of this event. So one of the particular notes that actually I brought up in this writing is how Sukarno acting in kind of like architectural way. So in selecting the buildings, the venue for the conference, because he was a student in the city, in the Bandung of Institute of Technology, and also renaming the building, appropriated the architecture of the buildings, also the streets. So there is like a streets rename, Asia Africa Street, about a month before the conference. So Sukarno and the local conference committee appropriated the architecture of the buildings, the streets, inverted the meaning of the place, and imbued his opening speech entitled "Let a New Asia and a New Africa Born," with an optimistic and revolutionary idea that the former colonies would rise together from their shared histories of colonialism and racism. So Bandung became a symbol for the anti-colonial movement, and from the mutual solidarity of this project, a metonym was constructed through the architecture of the Gedung Merdeka, or the Merdeka building and the urban space, to reverse the course of history for the new independent Indonesia and for all nations of Asia and Africa. So yes, so what I'll be wrapped up. So what we're seeing on these photographs here, this is Sukarno and Ruslan Abdul Ghani, which is the chair of the Joint Committee Secretariat, studied the blueprints, the drawings of the Merdeka building. And specifically on your right, they also inspecting the urinoirs, the lavatories, due to the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru expressed concerns about the lavatories, and writing quite anxiously to his ambassador in Indonesia about 2 months before. And it's kind of like highlighted one of many practical challenges that needed resolution for this historic gathering. Quote, Nehru wrote, "I am rather anxious about this Asian African conference." And it's kind of like concern the inadequate facilities that might undermine the conference dignity. So the issue is not only the comfort, but also reflecting deeper cultural expectation. And then the Indonesian officials responded with photographic evidence, which is like a kind of like how the South-South cooperation and also solidarity as a new nations happen in this particular city, and then also in this particular building. So this exchange, rather than revealing a weakness in South-South solidarity, illustrates precisely how the diplomatic theater of Bandung worked by acknowledging and resolving such contradictions to realize the larger ambition of a unified post-colonial voice on the world stage. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rina. Thank you for staying perfectly within time. Let's move to the next presentation, Priya, Jain.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Just give me a minute. Can you all see it full screen? Yes. Okay, great. Let's get started. Thank you for inviting me to this panel, and happy to see you all. So my talk investigates how the transfer of technical expertise, particularly building research, was leveraged by India from the 1950s to the 80s. I do so through the lens of one material, black cotton soil, that occurs naturally in large parts of India's Deccan Peninsula, as well as in other parts of Asia, Africa, Australia, and the United States. As the name suggests, these dark-colored clay soils worked well for growing cotton during colonial rule. However, they were problematic for constructing roads and buildings due to their tendency to shrink and swell, which led to foundation settlement and structural cracking. As many countries of the Global South embarked on ambitious development programs in the mid-20th century, they grappled with building on black cotton soil. It was during this time that the nascent state-sponsored building research enterprise in India honed on it as an area of expertise. Newly established agencies like the Central Building Research Institute and the Central Road Research Institute developed novel techniques to build effectively in these soils. In 1957, the Central Road Research Institute carried out field tests on the Bhopal-Diwanganj road using a small amount of lime. This method showed promising results in mitigating the cracking. In the case of buildings, none of the prevalent methods like strip or pier and beam footings, backfilled trenches, or board piles provided dependable and, most importantly, economical solutions. This was exactly the charge that CBRI, established in 1950 at Roorkee, took upon itself. The man leading this charge was the head of the nascent Soil Engineering Division, Dinesh Mohan, who would eventually go on to be the CBRI director for almost 2 decades, from 1964 to 82. Mohan had trained under a prominent soil mechanics expert at the Building Research Station in England. The technique he proposed was of under-reamed piles, which, due to their enlarged diamond-shaped base, worked better to resist the heaving action of the soil. Under-reamed piles were not a novel invention. They had been used in Texas since the 1920s and were also being tested in colonial South Africa. However, they had not yet been used in India. Suitable tools and machinery were unavailable. Mohan and other CBRI engineers like Giriraj Jain and A.K. Deb had to therefore first design indigenous and low-cost under-reaming tools, which they patented in 1955. Indian research on black cotton soils was in its early stages, yet it showed promising results and was clearly seen as an emerging area of expertise, so much so that it became the subject of one of the first reports issued by the National Buildings Organization in New Delhi. The NBO, or the National Buildings Organization, established in 1954, was one of 2 regional centers of the United Nations Economic Council for Asia and the Far East, with an express mission to coordinate building information in the Asian region and beyond. This decision to disseminate India's emerging research on black cotton soil was therefore born out of both an inherent and endemic need in the Global South, but also through mechanisms orchestrated by the Global North via agencies like the UN. In the years following the publication of the report, Indian institutes continued to attract visiting soil scientists from both the Global South and the North. It was therefore no surprise that in 1960, India took the lead in organizing the first Asian Regional Conference of Soil Mechanics and Foundation Engineering at New Delhi, where the Society President K.L. Rao stressed that due to, I quote, geographical neighborliness and common principal types of soils with similar problems, these regional conferences are the only effective means of discussing them to our mutual advantage, end quote. Just a year later, in 1961, a 2-day symposium was jointly organized by the NBO and CBRI, where India's black cotton soil research was touted as one of its significant achievements. Another important CBRI innovation was the manufacture of bricks made from black cotton soils. Indian research was also used as actual technical aid to Asian and African nations via bilateral liaisons like the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. For example, Y.C. Gokhale, senior scientific officer at CRRI, was deputed to Nepal in 1960 for 2 years as directing superintendent of the Road Research Laboratory set up there under an Indian aid program. Despite these independent efforts, a large part of assistance was provided via India's participation in various multilateral international cooperation programs like the Colombo Plan, UNDP, UNE-CAFE, and so on. In particular, I looked at India's participation in the activities of the International Council for Building Research Studies and Documentation, which was established in Geneva in 1953 as a consortium of building research stations across the world. CBRI and Mohan were very active in this organization. Mohan even served as vice president from 1974 to 77. In an article in this organization's journal titled The Influence of Indian Black Cotton Soil on the Building Tradition, engineer P.L. Day from CBRI talked about India's development of underreamed piles and the manufacture of bricks. In a section titled Following India's Example, they described how African countries were, I quote, greatly interested in following India's example in solving this major foundation problem, end quote. In fact, Giriraj Jain, the CBRI soil scientist, was deputed to work in Ethiopia with the Ethio-Swedish Building Institute and other agencies for 4 months in 1969. There, Jain adapted underreamed piles to the black cotton soils found in Ethiopia. He also helped to incorporate these guidelines in Ethiopian building codes. It is unclear exactly how this particular agreement was brokered between India and Ethiopia, but Jain's deputation does not appear to be part of any international program with the UN, SCAP, or CFTC. It is more likely that India's visibility of BCS research with this Geneva group was what led to the exchange. In conclusion, as one considers South-South and Afro-Asian solidarity through the lens of building and black cotton soil research more specifically, 2 key themes emerge. First, that the epistemic networks of the Global South were intrinsically intertwined with the Global North. As pointed out here, many, though not all, moments of South-South cooperation were brokered by the North, acts that could be viewed as a presupposition of leadership by the North and their desire to enter and control the changing political landscape. Early building research, developed and championed by the North, was initially positioned as a vehicle to help the Global South. This one-way transfer of knowledge from the developed to the developing world soon became problematic in the post-World War II era as technologies like prefabricated housing failed in the South. In an emerging proclivity for regional versus universal solutions, more developed countries of the South, like India, then emerged as conduits for the flow of expertise from the North to the South. Here, technologies like industrial brick manufacture, foundation design, etc., were reworked, indigenized, and repackaged for the Global South. This point is made not to minimize the contribution of the South, but to add specificity to the role it played in the global transfer of building research expertise. Indian scientists like Mohan and research agencies like CBRI could therefore be seen both as innovators and intermediaries between the North and South. A second theme that emerges is that the South-South construct suffers from many of the same problems that the North-South one did. Just as it was hard to migrate building technologies from the Global North to the South, it was also not seamless to simply move building research expertise between the South. Building research, as evidenced by black cotton soil work in India, took years of experimentation and suffered from domestic criticism and slow adoption. This made it harder for India to market these technologies as sure shot solutions. Moreover, while African and Asian nations in the Global South did share many common economic, social, political, and environmental factors, there were also key differences. The indigenized and reworked technologies, like underreamed foundations, had a higher chance of success in various African and Asian nations, but were far from plug-and-play solutions due to differences in soils, building practices, and availability of technical personnel, to name a few. This serves as a caveat against flattening the global South as we consider South-South cooperation in this instance and beyond? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Priya. We will now continue with our third paper. Mark and Anthony, the floor is yours, please.
Can you see my screen? Yes, it's on. Okay. Thanks to the organizers of the symposium, our presentation emerged out of an interest in the Common Man's Charter, published in 1970, part of an effort to shift Uganda's political direction. The ideological shift enshrined in the Common Man's Charter was by no means isolated, intertwined with the decolonization and Africanization of rhetoric across sub-Saharan Africa during the 1960s.
Anthony,
decolonization.
Sorry, your voice is a bit low. Can you speak a bit louder or into the mic?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yep. How is that? So decolonization and the associated ideology of Pan-Africanism were ideals held by the leaders of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, and Uganda's Milton Obote, who collectively formed the post-colonial think tank, the Mulungushi Club. A key goal of the Mulungushi Club was to address issues related to the advancement of political self-determination across sub-Saharan Africa. Architecture and infrastructure projects naturally formed an important and very visible component of post-colonial ideology. Significant was the conference centers built to host international dignitaries as part of the new post-colonial alliances, and where foreign policies of newly independent post-colonial states could be performed. Officially handed over to the Uganda government on the 15th of May, 1971, the Uganda International Conference Center and adjacent Nile Hotel was a flagship project built to showcase Uganda on the diplomatic world stage. The building itself was a result of the collaborative agreements fostered as part of non-aligned movement. In this case, a cooperation between Yugoslavia and Uganda. Before delving into the project, it is important to appreciate the context in which this research was undertaken, one in which access to archives is not only difficult, but also expensive. Further, in some cases, the state of the existing archives is in a perilous state. Responding to the rapidly unfolding diplomatic landscape ushered in by independence, the newly independent nations of sub-Saharan Africa were keen to play host to international level conferences and sought to build venues where diplomacy could take place. These places of diplomacy were, according to Shimazu, the public places in which diplomacy could be seen to be accountable and concrete sites of interaction between the local, be it the place or the people, and the global. Conference centers emerged as a much sought after building typologies for the newly independent nations across sub-Saharan Africa, seen through the projects such as the Mulungushi Hall in Lusaka, Zambia 1970, the Uganda International Conference Center in Kampala, Uganda 1971, Kenyatta International Conference Center in Nairobi, Kenya 1973, the Palais de Conference in Libreville, Gabon 1977, and the Sheraton Hotel and Congress Center in Harare, Zimbabwe 1986. Apart from the Kenya International Conference Center, all the other projects emerged out of collaborative arrangements with Yugoslavia and the FAM ENAGO project. The Uganda International Conference Center was only the second project by ENAGO project in sub-Saharan Africa, and a particularly ambitious one, being twice the size of that in Lusaka. The contract with ENAGO project for what was described as the first phase of the project included the conference hall, hotel, external works, with a sum of 105 million Uganda shillings, an equivalent of about 14.7 million US dollars, which represented 10% of Uganda's GDP at the time. The 6-month timeline for the construction contract, while more generous than the 3 months available for the Mulungushi Hall in Lusaka, was still ambitious, given the scale of the project. What is evident looking at the original design drawings was the fact that the project included several additional buildings that were not built. The halting of the phase 2 of the project was in part linked to the coup d'etat in January 1971, which brought Idi Amin to power. Over to you, Mark.
Going back a few months into the construction of the project, Uganda's President Milton Obote had led the Ugandan delegation to the third Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Lusaka. He sought to host a similar international summit in Uganda, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, annual general meeting of heads of state from across independent Africa. In a display of unity evoking the spirit of the Mulungushi Club, Julius Nyerere and Milton Obote arrived in Lusaka on a shared flight from Dar es Salaam. Given the status and significance of the OAU summit, the completion of the Uganda International Conference Center became a high priority project for the Uganda government, showcased by involvement of the president at all stages of the project. However, barely 2 months into the construction of the project, on the 25th of January 1971, while Obote was in Singapore attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, Idi Amin, then the commander of the Uganda Armed Forces, staged a coup d'etat, taking over as president of what he called the Second Republic of Uganda. Although the coup could have altered the project, eager to showcase its progressiveness, the new government made a decision to honor the existing contract, allowing construction to continue to ensure the OAU summit could continue and go ahead as planned. For Idi Amin, the project was a symbolic center for Uganda's self-determination push and what came to be known as Uganda's economic war. It was at the conference center, nevertheless, where in December 1971, he held a conference with leaders of Uganda's Asian African community, steadfastly admonishing them for what he claimed were their anti-Ugandan activities. The setting, a building designed for an Organization of African Unity summit, and as a place of diplomacy, being used to lecture those whose recent ancestry was from South Asia, clearly something lost on him. He went to expel the 80,000-strong community in 1972, a critical event in Uganda's history. Seeking a site for the new conference center, 2 plots had been put forward. The first, the proposed site for the Kampala City Council Conference Hall east of the Old Town Hall and adjacent to Uganda's Parliament building. On a site occupied by the immigration officers. The design of the project was fairly advanced and in its pre-construction phase, with the contractor, the Italian firm Italide, already selected. Italide had just completed Crested Towers, a steel-frame 20-story office tower, which stood as the tallest building in Uganda in 2017, and that's where this photograph has been taken from. We'll see the building on the next slide. While the site for the proposed Kampala City Council Conference Hall was favored by Obote, it was soon realized that the site created a security risk, being too close to the Parliament building, and it was also acknowledged that it would have been a challenge to get dignitaries across the 4-lane Apollo Avenue between the Parliament and the Hostel site. The decision was made to use the site then occupied by the Kampala Sports Club and police officers' mess, which required only minimal adjustments to site boundaries and limited road alignment. The development of the conference center project coincided with the development of a new master plan for Uganda's civic district by the architectural firm Pitfield and Bodgena, which sought to develop a formal civic district that didn't exist before. This plan was never implemented, another consequence of the coup. Beyond the Organization of African Union Summit, for which the conference center was built to host, and the prestige value associated with hosting numerous heads of state, completion of this project was pivotal in the socio-political transformation of Uganda, overtly exhibited in this case through architecture. At a broad level, the project presented as a symbolic break from the erstwhile designs by British-educated architects and Western modernism that had been the main design mantra during the early post-colonial years. Klaus Schlicht notes that the architecture of governments can be viewed as the petrified objects of a global history. This holds true for the Uganda International Conference Center, which is burdened with a history that is difficult to shake. Nevertheless, the building stands as a visible manifestation of the values enshrined in Uganda's post-colonial development. What is evident from this exploration, which we can read in the publication, the South-South collaboration, is the extent to which such buildings embed within them significant histories beyond what is immediately evident. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Anthony and Mark. And I believe Amit is going now to step in to present Shivani's paper.
Thanks, Vladimir. Just give me 1 second. I just realized I do have an image that I can share, which will make it nicer for everybody. It looks like it doesn't want to do that. Okay, can you guys see that shot of the Afro-Asian Housing Congress? I will use that as a background. So what I'm going to present, of course, is the work of Shivani Shede, who is actually working with us on the broader South-South project. So I'm going to very quickly try to give an overview. I think the reason we thought we wanted to include this, of course, Shivani couldn't join because it's quite late in the US, but we thought that the case study that she's working with, particularly the Afro-Asian Housing Organization, is an important one to bind this thing together. So Shede's chapter asks basically what happens to the project of the Third World Solidarity when it moves out of the examples that we've seen right now, such as conference halls, and goes on to the building site and the challenges that people are facing. So taking the Afro-Asian Housing Organization, or AAHO, as its subject, it tracks how solidarity was not only proclaimed through grand political declarations, but was also enacted through the more unglamorous work of housing policy, technical expertise, and architectural knowledge exchange. Shede situates the AAHO within the broader genealogy of Afro-Asian solidarity, looking at things like the APSO Conference of 1957 and the rhetorical heights of anti-colonialism and other ambitions to remake the post-World War II world order. The first Congress was convened in Cairo in 1963, is framed as an expression of Third World ambitions, held at the Arab League headquarters and attended by over 250 delegates, included figures like Hassan Fatih and Habib Rahman from India. The conference positioned housing as a form of reparation, where colonial governments had administered housing as an instrument of population control and labor productivity. The new post-colonial states were recasting it as, in Shede's work, a form of knowledge that could deliver citizenship and self-determination to their people. In Egypt, the housing crisis permeated architectural magazines and public discourse, and Nasser's government framed housing alongside agrarian reforms and nationalization of the Suez Canal as part of a unified socialist program. The conference was practically ambitious, too, calling for standardized building materials, prefabrication, management of population growth, and so on and so forth. The tension Shede shows would define the AAHO for the next 15 years. But by 1967, so in another 4 years, when the second Congress is held in Singapore, the political landscape has shifted. Yeah. Lee Kuan Yew has publicly declared a kind of end of that Afro-Asian solidarity that it started with, and the failure to hold the second formal Asian-African conference had exposed deep fissures that were developing in the movement. The Singapore conference reflected this. The Soviet delegation was absent. Any hint of communist rhetoric was kept at bay. The language of liberation gave way to the language of development. And Shade thinks this is a really important point to focus on, because she thinks that this is repositioning rather than a betrayal of the original idea. So Singapore's Housing Development Board becomes an important player at this point, and with its satellite towns and some clearance schemes, becomes the model that the AHO is now held up for emulation. The second Congress inaugurated what Shady describes as a new epistemic mission. Housing was to be treated as an experimental system. Delegates would tour new built estates. Papers were compiled into booklets and distributed to members, nations, architects, engineers, sociologists, and statisticians were expected to generate this information together. So knowledge exchange rather than the political alignment becomes the explicit currency of this organization. And by abandoning claims to international political power, Shady argues that the AHO positioned housing as a rational and universally shareable project. She suggests that it's better described as non-alignment than Afro-Asianism. The paper sort of then tracks the history of this organization into the third and fourth Congresses within the growing pressures of the 1970s and rapid urbanization, informal settlements, the oil crisis, and other forms of political instability across the member states. Each host nation inflected the conferences with its own internal politics. So in the third Congress, which was held in Dar es Salaam in 1970, it was in the shadow of the Arusha Declaration and Nyerere's commitment to socialist self-reliance. The University of Dar es Salaam Building Research Unit became an example of the kind of technical infrastructure that the AHO promoted. It was a center for disseminating housing knowledge across government bodies, architects, and communities. At the fourth Congress, which we moved to New Delhi in 1975, and the focus shifted further towards economization. Demonstration houses showcased cost-specific typologies categorized by income brackets. It's for those of us who are in India, we kind of know these kind of things around economically weaker sections and low-income housing groups. So India's national building organizations pushed this kind of standardization and prefabrication, and delegates debated financing, land tenure, and the training of personnel. So the aspiration of self-determination had not disappeared, but it was now expressed through material efficiency and financial self-sufficiency rather than anti-colonial proclamations. The fifth and final Congress that Shady talks about is held in Accra in 1977, which was registered the changed conditions of the project once again. The AHO theme for this Congress was towards self-reliance in housing the Afro-Asian people. It acknowledged that solidarity between states could only be sustained by engaging with the new global economic order. And hopefully that'll come up in the discussion, and something that we talk about quite a bit, because by this time within the UN frameworks, the new international economic order has been proposed as a way to balance the inequalities between the North and the South. So acknowledging that solidarity between states could be sustained by engaging with this new global economic order, which also starts bringing in capital circuits and financial institutions into the play. Anyway, I want to sort of wrap it up. So in the paper, of course, Shady concludes that AHO is a case study on how this sort of language of development intersected with and over time departed from the language of solidarity, and what those relationships were over that period of time. And the organization facilitated knowledge exchange not as a model of aid delivery in terms of development, but as state building and at a transnational scale. The horizontal model designed to circumvent the dependency relationships of bodies like USAID or the World Bank allows this to become a case study in its own right. Its limitations, of course, Shady says that it's increasing instrumentalized in state legitimacy, and that's a different matter. But the idea of technical knowledge exchange as a basis of staying outside of the political rhetoric and talk about solidarity at that scale is the core idea that Shady's paper, and particularly the example of AHO, is something we want to bring to the conversation. So I'll stop there and we'll continue with the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Amit, for presenting Priyani's very important paper as it's representative of this cluster that you and I will talk about in the next paper more broadly in terms of that, the full scope of that project. But here we have a wonderful sample of the type of insights and across a broad spectrum of levels and types of knowledge that have been represented in these 4 papers today. I'd like to proceed to some prepared remarks that we, the chairs, anticipated asking. Just going back to my document where I got that. We have 2 general questions, which I'll ask Vladimir to present, and then we have some slightly more targeted ones that we'll present respectively to different papers. I hope we'll have time to quickly get these on the table, but the idea that we can generate some discussion between the 4 speakers around these questions. So, Vladimir, you have your copy of that?
Yes, I think we have a really fantastic combination of 2 papers that talked about the knowledge exchanges and 2 papers that discuss the hosting of events as sort of both the performance and the symbolic assertion of newly acquired sovereignty of southern nations. And I think this sort of combination of the modes of solidarity is really interesting, and in many ways actually overlaps several different we could say regimes of solidarity, where we see architecture simultaneously operating through multiple registers as an inhabitable framework for the relationship. For example, in the case of buildings that hosted international meetings, at the same time, they were the products of the exchanges, as we've seen actually in both Ugandan and Indonesian case, even in Indonesia, right, where the input from other nations with Nehru's anxiety in some ways shaped the space of the conference. And finally, we see these buildings as symbols, as built manifestations of South-South solidarity. And so spaces for solidarity, spaces built by solidarity, and spaces that symbolize solidarity somehow overlap in these cases. And I would like to pose a kind of general question to all our participants in each of your case studies. How does these dimensions overlap and relate to each other? And perhaps which one proved the most politically charged?
Anyone would like to go first? This is a question open to all 3 of our presenters today. All 4, sorry. Noting our double authorship team.
I'll start. I think thanks, Vladimir, for that question. It's very, very long, so I'll try to figure out where to start. The bit about the Uganda International Conference Center, we didn't present it, but in terms of the political charge situation in Uganda, relates to a project whose origins started in one political regime and ended in a different one. And then in between that, we also had a long drawn-out international conflict on even the hosting of the reason the building itself was built. So the building was finished in 1971, and the hosting of the OAU summit didn't actually happen until 1975 because the Organization of African Union at the time had an internal battle of whether to support a government that had just staged a coup. So the crises of politics and international politics were now played out in a completely different way with a building that was coming out of solidarity politics, but now becoming a backdrop for something completely different. And so these are some of the themes that have sort of dogged this particular project for a long time, and up to quite recently until the 1980s, when other issues were going on with this particular project. So it's those stories that make this building itself quite interesting to study. They're hinting of the buildings or the phase 2 of this particular project, again, which was also not built, linked to ideas of what the aspirations of what the OAU wanted to be. So that one is a very undiscovered part of this project. So there are little hints about it, but no one is quite clear as to what that part of the project was intended for, because it wasn't purely a commercial development. There was a little bit more going on there. So the underlying themes are making our understanding of that project appear in a very different light than what it originally was presented as. Thank you.
I would like to add to what Mark has highlighted and just draw emphasis on a section on our chapter that talks about the hijacked legacy. And this is something that we think falls under this political charge. And under this is also the stories behind the dark history that was alongside the hotel, which was built as part of the project of the International Conference Center. So these things or these aspects are also, I would say they also fall under this category of that intense history about the place and the building. Thank you.
Yeah, in case of Indonesia, the Merdeka or the Freedom building, the space itself was actually designed as a private. This is actually a plantation society at Concordia. So for the planters, Bandung was the city of the tea and coffee and quinine plantation. So this is where the planters hang out. But it is not only the planters, it is also the heart of the colonial and imperial regime, which is, the aristocrat met there. So the idea to turn the history of this plantation into the, let's say, South or Asian African independent nations, I think is very important. But also in Southeast Asia, there's also a Japanese period in 1942 and 245. And that's actually, at the time, this building, this space was at the center of the Kapetai, of the Japanese military, as a cultural, they call it cultural, but also military post because of the center position of this site in relation to the city. So I think both of like political symbol, and also a practical, making this building, becoming important again. However, so I was born in Bandung and I'm Bandunger still. For the resident of Bandung, this building is not becoming their own space because the Jakarta, the central or the central government actually owned the space. So there's and the contradiction and then the follow-up of that using the use of the space, it's actually still, how can I say, yeah, contradictory, and also that it's still going on right now. I think that's actually, I want to add how the history of the space, and then the uses for one important event.
Yeah, I think I'll quickly jump in. I mean, in my case, I think the black cotton soil, I think for me that was, in the colonial times, I was really struck by the name of it when I initially started looking at it. And I think in many ways it was a reframing of this kind of product from the colonial to the post-colonial time as something that was really just valued for its potential to grow these commercial crops that were of value to the British. And then in the post-colonial time, the soil was really seen as something that could be utilized for building India's new housing, new industry, and therefore it had to almost be recast as something, and that problem of building on black cotton soil, right, had to be solved. So I think it was a very relevant and an immediate, I think, concern for the country. And in many ways, yes, it was kind of reclaiming, what this kind of soil of, our country meant for, the post-colonial India versus what it meant in the colonial times.
Thanks, Priya. If I may come in actually with a question that Vladimir framed, but is pertinent to your paper in particular, because you talked about this fact that I think in one way or another, each of the papers reveals that cooperation never occurred between fully equal partners. And in your case, you talked about how, I guess, this rather peculiar and important technical problem of black cotton soil became a strength, in a sense, for India in those decades of building these knowledge networks. So the question is, how did architecture both carry the genuine force of solidarity, or architectural science in this case, of solidarity, and register the asymmetries running beneath it?
Yeah, one thing I
elaborate a little bit more on that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I talked about some of the things, but one thing that I didn't touch on as much is that, of course, India was kind of eager to use this expertise as to build kind of Afro-Asian solidarity, but there was also, of course, this desire to highlight it on a global stage, and again through the Geneva organization, through other kind of building research. So because that space was still so dominated because of the hierarchies, the political, economic hierarchies that still existed, that space was dominated by these countries from the global north. And India still wanted to, kind of stay relevant within that world. So, I mean, remember when Amit first kind of, talked about the South-South project, and I was like, yeah, I've been reading about it. To me, it was a bit of a sobering, I think, realization kind of as I worked on it, as much as I wanted, for this to be this kind of aha moment where we were able to kind of shun the global north and kind of totally kind of form these networks within the global south. That kind of persistent, kind of more sobering reality, I think, was always present. And I think that was intentional. Like I said, India, while we were wanting to kind of have our own sovereignty and all of that, we still wanted to stay relevant within the broader global north networks. And I think that is displayed in a lot of these exchanges.
Yeah, I was interested. Oh, go ahead, Vladimir. Yeah.
This is fantastic, right? The fact that something that seems to be utterly pragmatic, right, as the technology exchange absolutely always carries a representational value, right, about asserting one's position on the global stage, which absolutely, I think, connects in a sense all of the papers that we heard today, right? There's the symbolic surplus, and whatever is being done about making space for myself on the international stage.
I'm conscious that we're getting close to our closing time, so we have two more questions that we sort of prepared, but I have one that I think might be accessible to both Anthony and Mark, as well as Priya again in particular. But really interested if Rina has something to say to that, or indeed Amit on behalf of Shivani. Something that almost all members of the emergent global South had in common was this legacy of technocratic institutions and agencies inherited from the immediate colonial past. And we heard some of those names and new ones that sort of echoed them. Whilst the architectural forms and construction methods of these newly independent states were changing rapidly, it was the received machinery of state, such as public works department systems, that had been replicated throughout the British Imperial Empire and comparable ones surely in the Dutch Empire, that on which most post-independence governments still had to depend for agency and oversight of the new projects. So my question is, was there sufficient parity between such pre-existing institutions, systems, and networks to enable constructive peer-to-peer knowledge exchange? And that's, I'm thinking particularly in the housing sector, and cooperation between ex-colonial nations, and at what levels? Where did it happen well? Where didn't it happen well? And to what extent did such common capacities gained through parallel colonial experience also potentially encourage or enable solidarity and innovation in breaking free from the inertia of such, established practices as well? So I guess in both in forms, but also in means and modes of production. So I'm interested in say how novel some of those things you talked about, Priya, were the NBO, these building science organizations. Did they see themselves as being, a break away from the public works legacy, or just kind of another sub-department of that, or indeed just a new name on something that they were already doing? And perhaps, I know that the drawings that you guys sourced for the conference center in Kampala were in the private records of a retired public works chief architect or whatever that still held on to these things. So how much were the methods that had existed before independence carried over into or competed with this novel stuff which we hardly talked about, the procurement through Yugoslav construction systems of getting things built? How much was there kind of a clash or sort of an understanding of how you do this stuff? Again, sorry for a long, wordy question, but hopefully you all have something to say to these questions.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for that. That question in the context of Uganda actually is a very long answer because the background is the reason Enago project was brought in is because the legacy of the public works in Uganda made it actually impossible for the traditions, the construction methods in Uganda to actually build something of the desired quality that the government wanted. So a number of firms, as part of the call, when we went through the archives, one of the calls that was made were for an architectural firm to also nominate a local construction firm that they felt could achieve the project in the period that was intended and to the quality that was being specified. And only one firm actually fulfilled that requirement of all the, I think there were 6 firms that selected or submitted bids. Only one of them actually met that criteria. So there was a real shortage of reliable firms. We also found a letter from the Israeli firm Solidarities, which made it point blank that nobody could actually do it. They're the only ones who could actually build something of the quality that was required in Uganda because they had expertise in prefabricated domes. They're the only ones who could actually do that in Uganda. And then you had another aspect of this Enago project, having just completed a project in Zambia. Their response was, well, we can actually transfer human capital from Zambia to Uganda to help fulfill the needs of the project. So there are lots of underlying stories that go on with one small project that needed to be unpacked for us to see what was going on in the context of Uganda. The choice of using prefabricated construction on this particular project was a direct result of the lack of technical expertise, because they were able to control what was being done at that point. All the prefabrication was actually done on site. You could make your prefabricated beams and then just use a small crane to carry them onto the building, which was literally next door. Getting back to the idea of housing, which was part of your question, Tony and I are working on a different paper that is looking at that particular issue, which looks at the development of middle-class housing in the context of Uganda, which is linked to this idea of technology as well. And that aspect also has investigations linked to prefabricated housing, which had began during the 1950s when the Public Works Department did exist. And Ernst May was a German architect who did some work in Uganda. He did the Kampala extension scheme, was contracted to explore new housing typologies in Kampala, again using prefabricated modes. But after independence, and I'm not quite sure when the Public Works Department became the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, but that shift meant now the need for housing moved to larger scale construction. So Solibone, the Israeli firm which was working in Uganda in the late 1960s, that was their main task. In addition to building transportation infrastructure in terms of housing, their job was to ramp up production of middle-class housing in Uganda, but they only again managed to get through phase one before they were thrown out of the country. So there's a long story of lots of different activities going on related to this. Thank you.
Thanks.
I can quickly jump in. So in the case of the CBRI and black cotton soil research, of course, there was kind of coordination between all of these building research institutes across the country, across the world. Dinesh Mohan actually trained at the UK Building Research Station. That's where he kind of gained his initial expertise in soil engineering. And throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Indian engineers were constantly traveling to various countries in Europe, other places, and other people from other countries were coming to India as well. So it was a very kind of active space where they were kind of coordinating and sharing information. But that was happening kind of within these building research stations that were seen, as I think Peter, you said, as very distinct from the more established PWDs that had existed since colonial times. And there, at least I found, a lot of kind of strife between the two, because the CBRI in their reports are often lamenting that the PWDs are not very receptive to these new techniques, and they're kind of stuck in their old ways. So they started offering them subsidies so that they would adopt their under-reaming foundation method as opposed to the age-old techniques that they had been using. So there are many kind of specific examples of how they were trying to, kind of make them use these methods more than they had been.
Thank you. Rina,
I
did
will
you
just
want to come in? Yeah.
just add a little bit. So part of my research is also tracing the vernacular builders. So, I mean, of course, architects, engineers, they studied whether in Indonesia or in the Netherlands, and then after the independence in the Germany, in the United States. However, these vernacular builders is family-owned contractors, and the name is actually in Dutch, but they are not Dutch. Aannemer is constructor, but this Aannemer in post-colonial Indonesia, they're actually a mixed race of Chinese Indonesian or an Indo. So it's a kind of like a different kind of a mix of, race, but they still follow the colonial practices. And so, for example, during the Dutch colonial, one particular family actually built that Concordia, the Merdeka building, and then during non-alignment, the same family, but perhaps the second generation and third generation, actually work with the non-alignment projects. So this brokerage in the kind of like whether it's private or public, or whether it's national or international, it's still the same. I mean, even though the changing of many political regimes and also the violence that happened in the most likely in 1965 that actually attacked this vernacular practices.
Thank you. I think
I just wanted to sort of jump in, also noting that we are getting
Right.
over time, so I'm going to keep this short, but also use this thing that you put up, Peter, about the idea of how existing structures and continue and affect new things that are coming in. And I think over the overall project, I think it's also worth thinking about it from the perspective of what we do as historians. And I find that quite interesting that we set out to tell transnational stories because we want to erase the obvious nation state idea that keeps popping up, and yet we end up talking about it all the time. We want to talk about, exchange at a non-political level, and yet we always end up talking about political actors. And we want to talk about the the sort of unknown labor and materials that constituted that reality, and yet every paper pops up with names of, what did Nasser do right or not, or so on and so forth. So the challenge always is that I think as historians, we've also got to be mindful of the fact that these tropes, these things continue to persist in our work. And, almost all the papers that are discussed, there are these little apologies at the end that, oh, yes, it is South-South, but, there's a little bit of North in there, and it is South-South, and it happens in this way or the other. And I think as historians, if we acknowledge that what we're trying to do, we're not being naive about it, but we're also mindful that there are these narratives that exist, that we're willfully trying to not give as much presence as it has had in the past. I think there are different ways of telling this story without here, like, and I've talked about this for a while now, and every time we hear an apology around why the whole Third World Project failed or the South-South failed, and the thing all comes back to the failure of the Third World to organize itself, or political ambitions getting in the way. And those realities are there, and they extend from a kind of past. And just like the legacy of different institutions, I think as historians, we carry that burden as well. So I think it is an interesting, I know I've sort of veered away from the point you were trying to get to as a historical reality of the institutions, but I think as historians, that's an interesting thing to think about as well. And in my head, this kind of connects me back to what was discussed in the previous roundtable around the feeling of solidarity. And for me, the question always is, regardless of what the political or institutional motivations were, the individuals who committed their time and life in, enacting these things, what were they motivated by, and what were they trying to achieve? I think that is a valuable story that needs to come through. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I know we're at the end of time, so I'll leave you guys to bring the session to a close. Thanks.
We actually have one question from the audience that probably...
Oh, I would love to have one. Yeah, that would be great if we could. Just
answering in this last minute, and it's for Mark and Tony. I will ask you to be concise so that we can allow Peter and Amit to prepare for their own lecture that is coming, but I'll read it for everyone. How has the meaning of buildings like the Uganda International Center, Conference Center changed over time as the political context changes? So back to representation, to what I tried to ask. Thank you for reinforcing that.
So the conference center is now being packaged under the Serena hotels. So as a luxurious, go-to place for activities, it is still thriving in that regard. Within the political context, there are other places that have come up that have been used for conferences such as the 2007 CHOGM conference, the Commonwealth conference, and it has sort of reduced the weight and the significance of the International Conference Center in that regard. So it's no longer looked at as one that aspires to be in that particular aspect. I don't know if Mark has anything else to add on this. I was trying to be brief.
No, that I think has captured it well. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think we have definitely exceeded our time, so we probably do need to thank our audience for that final question and for listening to this fascinating set of papers, and for our wonderful author contributors for doing a very noble job to condense what we know are much larger and developed arguments from the chapters you've developed for this collective book, which I encourage anyone who's got the stamina to stick with us for another hour, because we'll tell you more about the context in which these papers have come to light and come into our orbit and are really driving the broader questions that Amit and I will explain in the next session. But thanks you for thinking through architecture about how it can answer the questions we have here, in this case about solidarity and cooperation in the Indian Ocean world. And I hope our PATIO audience in particular has appreciated this further insight into the type of research we're doing to expand particularly the orbit of the India-focused scholarship to its broader sphere of influence and engagement. So on that note, we'll take another short break. I think in this case, how much time do we have, Amit? About.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thank you everybody for presenting. We're 5 minutes to 12 in India. We should give a reasonable, at least 10-odd-minute break. So maybe 5-7 minutes after the hour. So let's give ourselves about 10 minutes before we start. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks very much. Rina, Priya, Tony, Mark.
Thank you.